everybody, it's Chris, and it is now the 1-year anniversary of my show, Comic Tropes. So I thought I wanted to do something to acknowledge that and to really acknowledge you, because I probably wouldn't have kept doing this show if an audience wasn't continuing to build. But it has continued to build, and that's been tremendously rewarding to me. So I said to myself, what can I do to interact to some degree with the audience? So I announced that I would do an Ask Me Anything, and a lot of you responded by social media, email, YouTube, replies, messages, all sorts of stuff. I've got the questions here. It's quite a few, actually. I've got 28 people, and then some of them have multiple questions. So this might take a little while. I'm not going to do anything fancy with the editing, but I really appreciate this, and gives me a chance to share my opinions on comics and my show, and that's always kind of fun. So I thought I'd do something a little different. Without any further ado, let's get to it. My first question is from Michael Whisman, and he asks, who is your favorite hero, and what is your favorite costume of that hero? I would have to say Spider-Man, specifically the Steve Ditko version, although there are some others that I love quite a bit. I love the new Miles Morales costume that Sarah Pichelli designed. That thing's awesome. I love the Spider-Gwen costume that Robbie Rodriguez designed. And I also am very, very fond of both John Romita Sr. and Jr. But Spider-Man was definitely the first superhero that I connected with in a big way. I still really love that character. And there was something just very iconic and unique about the way Steve Ditko drew Spider-Man. He doesn't have, a superhumanly chiseled physique. It's more of, something like a runner or a swimmer, thin, muscular, but not like overly bulked up like some sort of pro wrestler. I thought that was interesting. I always related to his problems, Peter Parker's, because he was kind of like a down-to-earth real person with money problems and family problems. So I always have a soft spot for Spider-Man. He continues, what is your background in art, education, career, or just a lifelong collector? As an artist, I'm self-taught for the most part. I mean, minus a couple classes here and there throughout the years in, both high school and college, but pretty much just a self-taught artist. That's probably why I'm not a full-time professional. I do go to the occasional, like a drink and draw, at a bar where people just go to hang out and draw together. Dr. Sketchy's, that's like a franchise that's in a lot of towns where you can pay a small fee and get to see a burlesque dancer pose. That's really great practice, and that's also, just a fun opportunity usually to hang out socially with other artists. So I'll do some of those things to sort of try to keep my skills up, but not a tremendous background in art. Nothing. I did not go to art school. Let's see. Last question from Michael is, how did you become a proofreader for Invincible? Big fan of your channel. Keep up the good work. Thank you very much for the kind words, Michael. That means a lot to me. The reason I proofread Invincible is the same reason I proofread The Walking Dead and everything else that Robert Kirkman, and technically Robert Kirkman's imprint, Skybound, publishes. I met Robert Kirkman early on in his career. He had just self-published a comic called Battle Pope, his first limited series, and I thought it was really, really funny. I thought the artwork was great. I know the artist Tony Moore would probably say, oh, that was so long ago, but it showed promise. I thought it was a really cool, funny book, and I noticed a couple spelling mistakes. So I wrote to him. I was like, hey, you missed this and this. Ever since then, he's just been sending me PDFs of his books. And of course, now he's kind of a superstar because of stuff like The Walking Dead. And it's more his editors send me the proofs to check. And I'm not the only proofreader anymore. There's there's a bunch of people that proofread it now. But that's the story. Is I met him and we hang out at conventions, and I even just saw him when he came to my town's latest convention, the Emerald City Comic Con this past year. So we don't get to hang out like we used to, you know, what, like 12 years ago? No, more than that. Let me think. This is going back to at least 2001. Oh my gosh, that's like over 16 years I guess we've known each other. Anyway, that's all there is to it. I just know him. He asks me to proof his stuff. I try to whenever I've got the time. Jake Maynard Prose asks, what is a comic everyone hates but you love? You know, I bash the 90s quite a bit when I'm talking about comics overall. At the same time, I was super into comics throughout the 90s, so I've got a weak spot for characters like Darkhawk and Speedball, and I don't think that those are tremendously popular characters. They obviously haven't had their own, you know, solo book in, what, like almost 2 decades now. So they're not very popular. There's not a lot of love there, but I actually love a lot of the Marvel characters in the 90s. I even kind of like Sleepwalker. I love the Danny Ketch version of Ghost Rider. That's something that I like that isn't super popular. All right, Hooded Cobra Commander 788 asks me a question, and if you don't know who he is, Hooded Cobra Commander 788 has a channel where he reviews G.I. Joe figures from the 80s and 90s. And it's a great channel. I love it. He actually won one of my, my first giveaway. I just had hit a certain number of subscribers. I had a random giveaway. It went to him, and he made a video unboxing what he won, which was actually some G.I. Joe figures that I'd used in a video. And we ended up getting in touch, and we talk quite a bit. So because I like his channel, and he's been able to give me a lot of advice. I definitely recommend his channel. It's very funny. Even if you're just a casual fan of toys of that era, it's a very entertaining channel. He's a great guy. So he asks, oh crap, I can never think of something to ask for these things. Okay, here's what I got. What was your entry point into comic books? I guess that wouldn't necessarily be your first comic book ever, but the first comic that pushed you towards becoming a fan and a regular reader. And it's funny enough, since this guy reviews G.I. Joe, but it was to a degree G.I. Joe, and just before that, Transformers. I was way into Transformers and G.I. Joe toys, so when I discovered that there were comic books about them, and I started with Transformers, but it very shortly transitioned into G.I. Joe as well. I got really into that. I bought them at a local convenience store, and soon enough I was asking my mother, like, where can I get the issues that came before this? And this was well before the age of the internet, so we looked in phone books for like antique stores and stuff, and we discovered a comic book store about half an hour away from where I lived, and I would get back issues of Transformers and G.I. Joe initially. And over time, I just wanted to read more comic books, and these only came out monthly, so I started trying other things like Spider-Man and Iron Man and Batman because they were on the spinner racks right next to Transformers and G.I. Joe. So that's what got me into it, is just at first wanting more media about the toys that I was a fan of at that point in time. And then I sort of, at some point, left the Transformer and G.I. Joe comics behind and transitioned to just loving comic books in general. Let's see, Matt Lurch writes, what is your take on the geopolitical and socioeconomic climate in the last Kool-Aid comic? You know, that's a really interesting question, Matt. It's something that I have to give a lot of serious thought to. I think that perhaps taking advice or following what a walking, talking glass pitcher of sugar water says is probably not in humanity's best interests. He seems to have terraforming technology that can turn a normal forest into some sort of lush, fruity, sugary paradise. That worries me. I think that could upset the military balance of the world. I think also he seems to have a vault full of a never-ending supply of prizes and toys for children, and I think that that could drastically throw off the economy of the world. So I'm definitely very leery of Kool-Aid Man and his impact on the world. Let's see, Matt continues, what is the airspeed of an unladen swallow? Well, I guess that would depend on whether you meant an African swallow or a European swallow.
Huh? I don't know that.
Adam Lore writes, hey Chris, if you can remember, what is the first comic book you ever got, and do you still have it? I can definitely recall to a degree what it was. It was a Winnie the Pooh comic book. I don't know what issue number it was, but I definitely recall that that was my first comic book. I had it forever. I had it since I was a young child. It was in pretty deplorable condition the last I saw of it. I don't have it anymore. I sold off almost all of my comic book collection about 4 years ago, and that would have been in there with it. It wasn't something I felt the need to keep, I guess. So that was the first one that I remember I had when I was a kid. I also very clearly remember that I had copies of The Thing number 12 and The Flash number 327. Those would have been around 1983 or 1984, and they were probably given to me by my mom during like a long car trip just to keep me busy, something along those lines. You know, it was definitely sort of like a not usual gift for me that I would get these comic books. I remember that I reread them a number of times, sort of trying to figure out the story from before and wondering about it. But I didn't really know where to get comic books, so that was as far as it went for a long time. If we're talking about the first comic book I got myself, that would go back to Hooded Cobra Commander's question, and it was Transformers. I believe it was issue number 27, and it was just about some mechanic who got a hold of some Transformer guns and went on like a criminal rampage. It was pretty average, but it was more Transformers, so I was excited, and that's what I was buying for myself. Let's see. I don't know how to pronounce this name. Maybe Quiro? He says, why do I love comic books? That's a pretty open-ended question. I love the versatility of it as a medium. I think that you can tell pretty much any kind of a story with comic books. And you don't need nearly as many people as you do to produce a movie. I mean, you could do a comic book yourself. That's very appealing. Or you could do a collaboration, which is also very nice, but not with a massive team. So you know, the vision isn't diluted and spread out and compromised. I like that it's a small creative team that creates a comic book. I think that it combines some of the best aspects of both the novel, because it's the written word and we can see what people are thinking, and we can have text balloons, or text boxes I should say, that sort of describe the world or contrast the imagery with the written word. And then of course you can also take some of the best parts of cinema. I mean, you've got essentially no budget to the scale and the scope of what you want to accomplish. It can be very intimate, it can stretch over a long period of time, it can have massive explosions. You can just do so much with comic books. I think that I don't think we'll ever run out of ways to use comic books as a storytelling device. I love them. I just keep coming across good stories. It's because people can get their vision through with very little interference. Even when you're working at, like, say, a Marvel or DC, and you're writing a character like Superman that's, you know, got a lot of editorial oversight, it still doesn't have as much oversight as, say, the movie version of Superman, you know? The comic book is still a pretty small team of a writer, an artist, an editor, maybe a couple editors, but still, It's a pretty central vision. So I like that quite a bit. Does Anyone Care Artist, that's the guy's name, Does Anyone Care Artist writes, who do you think is the most underrated comic book writer? That is not an easy question because everybody's going to disagree on what underrated is. But I would argue that Rick Remender today is a underrated writer. Maybe that's a little crazy because, you know, he wrote a lot of comics for Marvel, and he writes a lot of comics at Image. So obviously he has a good, sizable audience and a lot of critical respect, but I feel like he might be the best overall writer in comics today. There are some writers that I think might be better at certain genres, but I think Rick can do so much from, you know, superheroes to sci-fi to horror, really, really insightful drama. I think Rick is incredible. Yeah, I mean, I'm a little biased, but because I know Rick a tiny bit, but I think he's incredible. I think he's a little bit underrated. I recommend him to like people all the time. Anthony Garnon, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, says, can you describe each decade of comic books in one sentence, Golden Age onwards? So that's why I have this stuff written down, is I could not keep this answer straight in my head, so I had to sort of like write it down along with the questions. So I'm just going to read my answer. 1930s, innovation. 40s, propaganda. I don't mean that as a bad thing, but propaganda. 50s, campy. 60s, counterculture. 70s, cosmic. 80s, gritty. I feel strongly about that. The 80s were gritty. 90s, speculation. 2000s, sadness. I feel like I should have come up with a better word, but I hope that's clear. I think trauma. Maybe I could just put trauma. Trauma might be better than sadness. So for the 2000s, I'm going to put trauma. 2010s, I have inbred, but we're only halfway through, so I'm probably a little too close to the decade we're currently in to name it accurately. But I do worry that comics are slightly too inbred now. That doesn't mean that there's badness across the board at all, but I do worry about that. And he asks a second question. Anthony says, are you returning to the UK anytime soon? I'd love to. I don't currently have any plans. I don't think I'll be doing any international travel this year. I did a fair amount last year, but I don't think I'm going to be able to this year. I've got a new job and I don't have a lot of vacation time, so I don't think I'm going to be able to do any international travel this year. But I would love to return to the UK. I would love to visit Manchester, Edinburgh, and Dublin. Those are all high on my list within the UK as places I would like to visit. So yeah, I hope so. I sure hope so. I love a lot of comics from all over Europe, and I hope I can start representing that a little bit more here on the channel. The Big Man writes, what's your best story from when you were in school? Okay, wow, my best story from when I was in school. I don't think it's going to be a comic book story. I'm trying to think this story through, like where to begin. I'll just start talking, and we'll see if I can get to the story. So the thing I've got in my mind is in college. I remember, and I went to college in New Orleans for whatever that's worth. Just, you know, deep South, Southern, hot. Drinking age was 18, so it was legal to drink when I was a student. That was that wasn't too much of a taboo. So there was a party at a fraternity house that my friends and I went to. None of us were in the fraternity. It was just a party to go to. And they made it look like a volcano theme, like sort of a tiki theme. As you'd go forward into the house, there was a big paper mache sort of volcano from like the stairs, the porch area, down to the sidewalk. You'd sort of walk through, a volcano, and there were tiki torches everywhere. And I remember thinking like, doesn't actually seem that safe having fire that close to something made out of something flammable, paper. So without trying to string you on, obviously it did catch on fire. I remember my friends and I were in one of the front rooms of the house, and I looked out and I saw that it had caught fire. And I don't know why, because there were tons of people there, but nobody seemed to be reacting. You couldn't get out the front. You could get out into the backyard, and there was sort of an alleyway from the backyard to the front of the house. Everything else was fenced in. That's pretty normal in New Orleans. So my friends and I are like, I think we should probably get out of here since the house is starting to catch on fire. Because it was spreading towards like the front of the house and the front door. It was pretty obvious this house was going to catch on fire. And so even though no one was really reacting, we sort of tried to go towards the back, but the back was really busy. Like it was just really packed. In fact, like I think that they had like a kiddie pool in the backyard, and there was a balcony up above. And I remember that earlier in the evening, we had taunted some guy who was really drunk, who was like, I'm gonna jump, I can jump into that pool. And we're like, yeah, do it, stop talking and just do it. And he jumped, and I think he like twisted his ankle, or maybe even broke his leg. But so that was already a pretty dramatic night. But it was totally packed back there. So what I did is I opened up a kitchen window and just crawled out into that like alleyway. And as soon as we did that, I remember that everybody lost their minds. Now, fortunately, we had just gotten out of the house, so we weren't part of the mayhem that followed. As soon as somebody saw like that I was crawling out of a window, it was like everybody finally acknowledged that the house was on fire. And chairs started going through the windows and stuff as people were like desperate to flee. They definitely could have just walked to the back. Like it was not necessarily imminent danger, but people just started smashing windows and jumping out of them and running to all four corners of the earth. And my friends and I just walked across the street and just sort of watched the house burn quite a bit. The firefighters did get there and they put it out, but that house had significant damage. But it wasn't my house, and nobody got burned or anything that I know of. So yeah, kind of a fun story.